Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round one coverage of the Zurich 1953 Candidates Tournament. This is a tournament that took place in 1953. The purpose of the tournament was to select a challenger for the then reigning world champion Mikhail Botvinnik. There were 15 players invited to the tournament, 15 of the strongest players in the world who had qualified by various means, and it was a 30 double round robin with the 15 players. So a long tournament with a lot of strong players. A lot of interesting chess was going on at the time, and particularly the King's Indian was being developed as a top tier defense. And so you see in a lot of the openings they have a very modern appearance in this tournament. Another reason for selecting this tournament as for giving coverage to is because of a tournament book that was written by David Bronstein. David Bronstein was one of the participants in the tournament, hoping to be a challenger. He had already played Mikhail Botvinnik previously and lost in the previous World Championship match, so he was looking for a rematch, but he had to win this tournament first. So he wrote the book on this tournament, and he has a very interesting writing style. He talks a lot about middle game ideas and not so much about the openings. He gives some tactical insights with brief variations, but not extensive variations. Mostly his annotations are just textual, talking about the ideas of the position with particular focus on the middle game. So it's a very interesting book to read, and I thought this would be a nice way to force myself to go through the book. And so I'm going to go through it round by round. I'm going to look at all the games of each round and choose one in a game of the day format, and then give the results of that round at the end of the video. So if you want to follow along in these videos, you can maintain the suspense. I won't give away the answer till the end, or if you're curious, you can go look it up and find out who won the tournament. But all in all, some interesting games and some interesting writing. So let's jump into it. From round one, I selected the game Taimanov-Bronstein. So with the white pieces, we have Mark Taimanov. He's the Soviet player for whom the Taimanov variation of the Sicilian is named. And with the black pieces, we have David Bronstein, the author of the book and the former challenger to the world champion. So let's see what they do. D4 to kick off the tournament, and knight F6, C4, and now C5, a Benoni. Not a common weapon these days, but it was popular through the 70s. Fell into some disrepute in the 80s and 90s, but I think maybe it'll be revived again. It's one of those openings it's hard to kill. D5, the main move. And then a lot of times people play this line in order to play the Benko gambit with B5. And you'll see a similar idea in this game. Although if you want to play the Benko gambit, probably this is the right time to get in the move B5. We'll see why in a little bit. What David plays here is G6, and we get knight C3. Just showing up the center and preparing the move E4. Bishop to G7 is what's normally played here. I almost start playing it automatically. At this point, well, actually it's one of two moves. D6 is also a very popular move at this point, and now E4 showing up the center. And now Bishop G7 is the overwhelming move in this position. Bronstein plays a very rare move, B5. And it's just not quite as good in this position as it is earlier. But this is like a Benko gambit, and so you can think of it in those terms. White goes in and takes, which is generally the best response. Takes. Knight F3, just developing castles. Bishop E2, so we get some normal developing moves. But this is already one difference. In the Benko gambit, the way it's normally played, there's typically A6 is played, there's an exchange, and the bishop comes to A6 to challenge the bishop while it's still on F1. In this game, now A6 is played and white has time to castle. He takes first, and bishop takes, and then white castles. So he never had to face this problem of how to recapture the bishop on F1, which you get in the Benko gambit. So as a result, this way of playing it is not quite as strong. And white is basically just up a pawn. Black has some compensation, but really not worth it. Okay, but the game continues, queen c7. And right here, White embarks on a plan that Bronstein criticizes in the book. What he says is it would be better to develop the bishop to f4, place the queen to e2, and put the rooks on b1 and c1, and then push on with the move b4 here to undermine the pawn on c5. That's how he recommends playing this position, how he's played it in the past. But Taimanov has a different idea. He's going for a more direct approach. He wants to support the push e4 to e5, and he starts out with this move rook e1. So knight bd7 is played, and now the exchange. And this was an interesting moment too. Actually, you see White waited until the knight moved before exchanging bishops, so that take back with the rook is forced. What Bronstein says about this is actually it was part of his plan to have the knight develop in this fashion. Not there. That's not a legal move. There. To get to or to influence the c4 square from either e5 or b6. And so he wasn't happy with the idea of taking the bishop with the knight, which is kind of a standard response here. So he was happy to play knight bd7, and he was okay with this move because he wanted to have his rooks on the a file. So we get the queen to e2, continuing with this plan of pushing the e-pawn. He plays rook f to a8. And now this sort of discourages the push. He gives a variation here where if the pawn is pushed at this point, it kind of liquidates White's advantage. White still has a pretty good edge here, but if he were to push on with e5 now, Black could just take, and there would just be a bunch of exchanges here. White needs to take back, and at the end of all this, what he points out is that king f8, the king comes over and defends the e-pawn, and a lot of the force has been removed from the board. White is still a pawn up, but these pawns over here look like they're going to be in some trouble, and so White really no longer has a lot of winning chances in this position. So his doubling of rooks over here has somewhat discouraged White's plans. So White, sort of temporizes with the move h3, and Black continues developing his knight b6, looking at the c4 square. Now bishop to g5, and this knight drops back. He's not interested in trading that knight. He wants to hold on to it and maybe route it later to this e6 square, which will open up if ever the e5 push is made. So bishop to d2 was played, and this is in response to a kind of threat. But actually, what Bronstein's comment is here is that it would be better for White to ignore the threat and just play the move a3. So, for example, a3, bishop takes a3. This is the threat. It's winning a pawn. And he gave this as pretty much even. And actually, White is somewhat worse after the bishop retreat. So what's interesting is I checked this analysis with the computer, and it agrees with the Bronstein entirely up to this point, and it just says actually White is a little better. It's not just even, because White can exchange here and then bring the queen up to this b5 square. So this is the key move. He didn't mention this in his analysis, but it's attacking the knight, and the best defense is just to retreat the rook back here. And so White has given up a pawn, so the material is now even, so he's given up his one pawn advantage. But he's got an excellent active position, and so this would be good for White, and probably the best way for White to play it. So it's interesting that Bronstein had the right answer, even if he didn't completely analyze out the variation. So this move bishop d2, I guess you can, just from looking at it, think of it as being somewhat of a passive move. So White keeps the extra pawn, at least for the moment, but his piece is just retreating. So let's move on to the game. Knight a4 is played. Again, putting pressure on these weak squares over here on the queen side. So knight takes, rook takes, and bishop to c3, opposing the bishop. And now Finally, black could just take the pawn, although at this point black is maybe feeling he's a little bit better. The engine thinks, actually, the chess engine rates black as being slightly better, and he's not so in such a hurry to cash out his advantage. So, for example, if he were to go on and play rook takes a2 here, cancel that, rook takes a2, then after this exchange, now white can push on with the intended e5, and this position is about equal. Black has got his pawn back, so the material is even, but there's not these weaknesses on the queen side for him to attack anymore, and white's idea of breaking through in the center is starting to look a little bit more threatening. So the engine rates this as about even, but it's better for black to refrain from taking and play the way he did, which is to take the bishop, create some weak pawns over here, and then offer to go into the endgame. So we'll see that after queen d3 plays queen a6. And so this offer of an exchange of queens, what Bronstein is saying is that he thinks he's better positioned for the endgame, even being a pawn down, basically because of, let's change the color so it's a little more visible, because of these pawn weaknesses. White has these three pawns that are going to need some protection, and black's corresponding pawn weakness, the base of his pawn chain, is over here on e7, and as we saw before, the king can just come to f8 and defend that pawn, and everything is pretty okay for black. So black is figuring he's better for the endgame here, and he's not afraid to trade queens. White, for the same reason, avoids the queen trade, but now he can grab the pawn, and after a few exchanges, the queen trade is, well, it's not entirely forced. Actually, the engine thinks that white's best chance is to continue avoiding the queen trade and just playing queen d3. The material is even. Just keep the queen on so that you have enough force to protect all of your weaknesses, and you should be better. Not better, but you should be doing okay. You should be able to hold this game. So instead, Taimanov continued with his idea of pushing on with e5. And so I think this is an example of kind of the typical mistake that players at all levels can make, which is they have their middle game plans, their long-term strategic plans, and they keep on pursuing them even after the circumstances have changed. And after e5 and the trade of queens, this is no longer a middle game situation, but an end game situation. And really, what counts is the pawn weaknesses and who can best take advantage of them. And after d takes e5, rook takes e5, and king f8, once again defending the e-pawn, black just has the more easily defended structure. So already black is significantly better, and what Bronstein is recommending at this point is for white to just play for a draw. What he needs to do is get the knights off. If you could remove the knights, and if you could remove these three pawns, trade these two pawns, give up the weak one, trade those two pawns, then you would have a situation with rooks and 4 pawns against 3 on one side of the board. And that is, by and large, that's a drawn endgame. So he's saying basically that white should sue for peace at this point and try and play for a draw. And there's different ways to do that. Just king f1, trying to activate the king. The chess engine has a suggestion of knight to c4, which discourages black from playing knight d6, because after knight d6 you can trade knights and get into this pretty surely drawn rook and pawn endgame. So with the same idea, just a different set of moves to achieve what Bronstein was talking about. Okay, but white wants to play actively. This is Taimanov. He's an attacking player, and so he's going after the loose c-pawn, which is natural enough to go after your opponent's weaknesses. But it just turns out that white has more weaknesses than black in this situation. So the pawn just gets pushed, the knight has to move again. And now rook a1 check, gaining some, well, pushing the king away from the center. So black will also have the advantage of the more active king. Now the knight comes to f6, getting the knight into the game and putting pressure on one of white's weaknesses. Knight to e4. And black very much does not want to trade. If he does trade and we get into a pure rook and pawn endgame, like I said, he can give up 2 pawns for 1 and still hope to hold that endgame. So black is moving the knight, hitting the rook. Rook goes to g5. And rook a2, hitting the f-pawn. Rook to g4. And already, let's see, maybe I passed over an important point here. Already the computer's giving this as a winning edge for black. Let's see when it became winning. Right here. Yeah, okay, so was that move knight b3 I mentioned. We're talking about the engine is recommending knight c4. So after knight b3, the engine rates this as actually a winning game for black. And all this is pretty good play from that point on. Okay, knight d7, attacking the rook. And now rook a2 going after the f-pawn. And then rook g4, defending the knight. Then okay, the knight is defending the f-pawn. But already there's a problem with this move, f5, kicking the knight. Now it's not a, well, it is a fork, but Taimanov planned for that. He's planning to pin the pawn. But it's a bit awkward for this knight. It doesn't have a lot of squares. If you see, these squares are covered. It can go back to g3, I guess. And then those squares are covered. So, yeah, so it has a couple squares to go back to, but not such great squares, and the f-pawn is in danger of falling. Not right away. So knight b6, attacking the wayward, or the advanced d-pawn, which maybe was a strength in the middle game, but is a weakness in the end game. The knight goes to g5, and he grabs a pawn. So now black has achieved his first material advantage in the game. After sacking a pawn in the opening and struggling to maintain equality and gain the pawn back, he's now reached a position where he's got an advantage. Okay, rook to d4 was played here. Possibly a stronger defense is rook takes c4, just grabbing this pawn. Rook takes c4, rook takes f2. Yeah, you don't really win a pawn, it's just a trade of pawns. And there's actually a tactical point here, because if white continues to grab this pawn here, king g7, and the knight retreats, black can grab this pawn, which is kind of a cute trick. And then if the king takes it, he's got this fork. So there are tactics in these endgames, especially when there are knights and rooks involved, that you have to watch out for. And that's the reason why when their knights are on as well as the rooks, it's not so drawish anymore. It's a much sharper position. Okay, so the game went knight takes d5 and rook to d4, avoiding that continuation, but hitting the knight. Knight goes back to b6. The rook comes into check, trying to drive the king somewhere. And f4, hoping to stop the expansion of black's pawns. But black just kicks white's knight out of the camp and then goes after the next weakness, which is the pawn on c3 here. So rook to c8, the counterattack. Knight takes c3, rook takes c3, so there's a trade. And once again, if there were no knights on, this is 4 pawns against 3, probably drawing. But the fact that there are knights on makes all the difference. And the game ends quite shortly, because not only are the knights on, but they're actively posted here. And then there's a threat on g2 again. So after this move, knight f3, let's see, was there any other move? The engine is saying knight c2 or knight c6 was playable, but still losing for black. After knight f3, black has the tactic I mentioned earlier. So rook takes and king takes. There's the knight fork. So Taimanov tried king to h1, but then rook to f2 is going to win. So white resigned at this point. So pretty interesting game. It shows Taimanov's or Bronstein's idea from the opening. He had this middle game plan that he executed, and he kind of criticized Taimanov's middle game plan as not being the most active one, although it seemed logical enough to try to push the e-pawn. It's just Bronstein's comment was it just for concrete reasons that it was an idea that just was never going to work in practice, so he preferred the other plan. And then getting a slightly better endgame and keeping up the pressure and on the weak spots until he rounded up a material advantage and went on to win. So pretty nice, instructive game, I thought. Hope you guys enjoyed that. And I will be back with more coverage from the Zurich 1953 tournament. I meant to say, at the end of round one, there were 3 winners out of these 7 games. So let's see. Bronstein is at 1 point out of 1. F.M. Geller scored a victory. And Urve, the former world champion, Max Urve, also won. So there are 3 leaders of the tournament at 1 point. The players that lost were Kotov, Taimanov, and Szabo. And so they're in the rear, and the remaining players are at 50%, except for Gligorich, who's got the bye today, and so he's still at 0 points. So that's it for round 1 coverage. Stay tuned. I will be back with round 2 coverage, probably in about a week. I'm expecting to do about one of these a week. So see you guys later. Bye.